Hey there, welcome to the second half of chapter 23. So just a reminder what we did when we did the first half of chapter 23, we talked about the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation, and we talked about the assumptions of this model. And then the second half of the chapter, we go through each of the assumptions and give you more detail. So let's just review for a second what the assumptions were before we get started, so you'll understand the structure of this second half of the chapter. All right. Anyone around here? You want to tell me any of the 5 assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? Anyone? No natural selection! Yeah, no natural selection. Good job, dog. Anyone else? Cat? Stop calling on me! Alright, well, can you name one? Yeah, no non-random mating. Okay, no non-random mating. Anyone else? Oh, yeah! Yeah, Bird, what do you got? Large population size or no genetic drift. Yep. All right, we got 2 more. What about you up there in the corner? No mutation and no gene flow. Yeah. All right, we got all of them. All right, so we're going to start by talking about non-random mating. All right, so when we think about non-random mating, we often talk about inbreeding. So inbreeding, which is another way of describing mating between relatives, is a form of non-random mating. And self-fertilization, or selfing, is the most extreme form of inbreeding. Okay, so you're not only mating between relatives, you're kind of mating with yourself. So let me just remind you what self-fertilization or selfing looks like in a plant. So a plant has male parts and female parts, right? The male parts involve making pollen over here, and then making eggs over here in the ovule, okay? Or in the ovary. The ovule is made in the ovary. So what you can do is take your own pollen and use it to fertilize yourself, okay? So you're still undergoing meiosis here and here, okay? And you're still, kind of having sperm meet up with eggs here and here. So you're not producing clones of yourself. Instead, you are producing all the sperm and all the eggs and using them together, okay? So that's selfing. All right, so let's just imagine that you have a parent who is homozygous. Let's say we have 2 alleles, A1 and A2, okay? So if the parent is homozygous for A1, then all of the eggs that they produce are going to be A1, and all of the sperm that they produce are going to be A1, right? So all of the offspring that they produce are going to have an A1 from the sperm and an A1 from the egg, so they'll be A1, A1, okay? So that's easy. Conversely, if all of the parents are homozygous if a parent is homozygous for A2, then all of their eggs are A2 and all of their sperm are A2, right? So all of their offspring are A2, A2, okay? So if a homozygous parent selfs, all of the offspring are also homozygous. So that's pretty easy. All right, so if you're a heterozygote, though, you could have offspring that are a different genotype than you are. So if you're a heterozygote, meaning, what would be your genotype if you're a heterozygote? A1, A2. Yeah, good. A1, A2. Okay, so if your genotype is A1, A2, your eggs, you could put an A1 or an A2 into your eggs, and you could put an A1 or an A2 into your sperm, right? So you could have offspring that are A1, A1, A2, A2, or A1, A2, okay? Okay. So let's think about what happens each generation. So in generation 1, okay, let's say you're a heterozygote. Let me just show you the previous square again. You have 1/4 of your offspring, A1, A1, 1/4 of your offspring, A2, A2, and 1/2 of your offspring, A1, A2, right? 1/2 heterozygotes, 1/4 of each of the homozygous ones. Okay, so here you go. 1/4 of them are A1, A1, 1/4 are A2, A2, and 1/2 of them are A1, A2. Okay, so all of the A1, A1 offspring that come from that selfing event are going to have A1, A1 offspring, right? Because that's the only allele they have, so that's the only allele they can give to their kids. Okay, so that's what happens in generation 2. Okay, all of the A2, A2 offspring can only have A2, A2 offspring of their own, so that's what happens here. All right, so what happens with the heterozygotes? So in the next generation, right, they have, again, 1/4 A1, A1, 1/4 A2, A2, and 1/2 A1, A2, right? All right, so here we go. Here's the, so they have 1/4 A1A1, 1/4 A2A2, and then 1/2 A1A2. So now you can see we've lost some heterozygotes, right? Some of the ones in the next generation from heterozygote parents became homozygotes, and then in the next generation the same thing happens. So everyone who is A1A1 has offspring who are A1A1, everyone who's A2A2 has offspring who are A2A2. But the parents who are A1A2, half of those offspring are A1A2, but then 1/4 are A1A1, and 1/4 are A2A2, etc., etc., okay? So over time, you eventually end up losing all of the heterozygotes from your population, okay? So inbreeding increases the frequency of homozygotes. What are the homozygotes?
A1A1 and A2A2.
Right. And it reduces the frequency of heterozygotes. So what are those?
Oh, those are A1A2.
Okay, good. But it should be noted that inbreeding does not cause evolution. So when we're looking at evolution, we're looking at changes in allele frequencies usually. And what you find is that you find a change in the genotype frequencies, but you do not find a change in the allele frequencies, okay? So you always, let's just say you started out with 50% A1 and 50% A2, you still have 50% A1 and 50% A2, right? But all of those A1s are in homozygous individuals, and all of those A2s are in are in homozygous individuals also. So there are no heterozygous individuals by the end, okay? So your genotype frequency, whether you're A1A1, A1A2, or A2A2, changes, but your allele frequency, right, the amount of A1s you have and the amount of A2s you have, does not change. All right, if we were in person, I'd encourage you to explain this to your neighbor using your own words. Anyone want to try?
Okay, so every time you breed, you just make less heterozygotes than the generation before because so your homozygotes just stay homozygous every generation, and then eventually there's no heterozygotes left.
Yep, that's true. So what kind of change does it cause in your population?
Oh, it causes the genotypes to change.
Right, does it cause the alleles to change?
No, it's the same numbers of A1, A2.
Yeah, same numbers of A1, same numbers of A2.
Yeah.
Okay. You notice in many populations something called inbreeding depression.
That's sad.
Yeah, I guess it is sad. It refers to a decline in the average fitness that takes place when homozygosity increases and heterozygosity decreases in a population. So when you get fewer and fewer heterozygotes, the population can sometimes suffer health consequences.
So, why are those cats like that? I'm offended as a cat.
They're inbred.
Oh, can I have some bread?
Sure, you can have some bread. Okay, so we can see examples in nature of how inbreeding depression occurs. So this is a study, there's been a long-term study done on Florida panthers. There are very few of them. They're highly inbred, okay? And so people have brought in panthers from Texas to breed with them to decrease the amount of inbreeding. So this is the percent survivorship of offspring, okay? So offspring of parents that are both from Florida tends to be very low, okay? And the offspring that are crossed between Florida and Texas panthers tends to do much better. We know that in people, human people.
Yeah, human people.
Okay, human people. Children of first cousin marriages have higher mortality than those children that are coming from marriages between non-relatives. And this is probably one of the reasons why most societies have a stigma against marrying close relatives. People have figured out over long periods of time that if you marry close relatives, your kids don't turn out to be very healthy. All right, we're on to the second mechanism that causes evolution. So natural selection happens when heritable variation leads to differential survival and reproduction, okay? So remember our definition. You have to have heritable variation and then differential survival and reproduction, meaning some individuals survive more than others due to the heritable variation in a trait, right? All right, so natural selection should increase fitness, right? So if the individuals that survive the best in that environment are still there, then they should have increased fitness compared to the individuals that didn't survive. Natural selection is the only mechanism of evolution that leads to adaptations, meaning individuals being better fit for their environments. All right, so again, natural selection, you have individuals with certain phenotypes. What's a phenotype?
It's how they look.
Yeah, so they have certain phenotypes that allow them to produce more surviving offspring than do individuals with other kinds of phenotypes. If you have a favored phenotype that's associated with a particular allele, right, meaning if this phenotype can be inherited because there's a gene, right, or a particular genotype that contributes to that phenotype, then the alleles for that particular trait are going to increase in frequency in the population. An allele that does not help an individual survive and reproduce is going to decrease in frequency in your population. And so the result is evolution, a change in allele frequency over time. Okay? So if you have natural selection, then you've violated an assumption of the Hardy-Weinberg principle, right? So Hardy-Weinberg principle assumes, or the Hardy-Weinberg principle is a model that shows you what happens when no evolution is happening. So if you have natural selection, you should have evolution, right? All right, we talk about genetic variation a lot, and I want to talk about it specifically here. So this is the number and relative frequency of alleles that are present in a particular population. So how many different alleles are there? Is there just A1 and A2, or is there A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, right? Many different alleles. And what's the relative frequency of alleles? Meaning, is this population 99% A1 and 1% A2? Or are both of these alleles found in decent numbers in the population? It can be very important to maintain genetic variation in a population. And so we know that you can only have natural selection if there's heritable variation in a population, right? Natural selection doesn't generate the variation. There has to already be there, the variation has to already be there, right? And then the particular phenotypes that do better or worse in that environment survive or they don't survive. If you have lack of variation in a population, then that population is not going to be able to respond to changes in the environment. So maybe you're a population of insects and you don't have very much variation, and somebody sprays some kind of a pesticide on you. Maybe there is not that particular mutation in your population to survive the pesticide, right? So the more variation you have in your population, the more opportunity you have for natural selection to work. Okay, so there are 4 kinds of natural selection that we have named based on what kind of an effect they have on the frequency of alleles in the next generation. Okay, so yeah, the names describe how selection affects variation in phenotype, and then of course, which also contributes to allele frequency. Their names are directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, and balancing selection. All right, so directional selection. Directional selection changes the average phenotype of the population in one direction, right? That's where the name comes from. So for example, if you have this as your average value of a trait, so maybe we'll say this trait is size, right? Then most individuals are this medium size, and then you kind of have a few individuals over here who are really big, and a few individuals over here really small, right? So let's just say that if you were more towards this end, you have higher fitness, right? Then these individuals are going to have lots of babies, and these individuals are going to die, okay? So over time, you get a change in the average value. It shifts over to the right, okay? All right, so you can see that the average trait value has changed to become more favorable, has changed towards the more favorable trait value. Okay, so directional selection, right, it increases fitness. It does, however, reduce the genetic diversity of populations, right? So for example, if the environment changed and for some reason it was better to be, for example, smaller, you would no longer have that kind of genetic diversity in your population. So that's important to think about. We have particular terms that we use that are going to come up a bit, so I just want to introduce them. So if you have directional selection that is extreme enough that you lose an allele entirely, you say that allele is lost. if you have, for example, two alleles and eventually, like let's say you have A1 and A2, right? And eventually you have only A1s in your population because all the A2s have been lost, you would say A1 has a frequency of 1, so it's fixed, and you'd say A2 has a frequency of 0, so you'd say that allele is lost. Okay? Here's a real life example. So this is a population of cliff swallows, and there was in the population that was being observed, during the course of the time that they were observed, there was a cold spell, and it caused all of the insects to die. And these birds eat insects, so many of the birds starved. After this selection event, survivors were found to be much larger than the birds that died. And so you can see that this light green one represents the original population. This dark green represents the survivors. So the average value of body size was here in the original population, and then after the drought, it was here. And so we think that the larger birds survived because they had kind of a larger fat store, and so they could avoid dying of starvation and exposure to the cold for longer than the smaller birds.
That's really sad.
That they died?
Yeah.
Well, some of them survived.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. The second kind of selection is called stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection reduces genetic variation in a trait. The average trait value does not change, right? So if this was the average trait value before selection, it's still the average trait value after selection. But what happens is individuals that are at extremes are disfavored, and individuals that are of average value are favored. So if we again say this is height, we would say that medium-sized individuals have higher fitness, but short and tall individuals have lower fitness. So over time, you have fewer short and tall individuals, and the alleles for being very short or very tall are lost, right? So you can see two things about this chart here. The first one is that the entire bulge is narrower, but you can also see that it should be taller than the previous one because you have the same volume under this curve as under this curve. So if you were to try and draw this for yourself, note that this should be taller than the original one. All right, so an example of this is stabilizing selection in human newborns. Okay, and we have found over long periods of time measuring babies and how big they are, that babies of average birth weight tend to have the highest survival. Okay, if you have a very small baby, they are much more likely to die. Also, very large babies have health complications too. So we think that the alleles that are associated with high and low birth weights have been selected against, and the alleles associated with intermediate birth weights have increased in frequency. I mean, you do occasionally get kids who are like 11 pounds or 3 pounds, but I would bet the most of the time, if somebody tells you they've had a baby, they will say that the baby weighs somewhere between 6 and 8 pounds, right? And that's why. It's because of this stabilizing selection in birth weight. All right, the third kind of natural selection is called disruptive selection. And so this is when the intermediate phenotypes are selected against and the extreme phenotypes are favored. So it's kind of like the opposite of stabilizing selection. So in this case, in the original population, it is the worst to be medium, and it is the best to be either small or large, okay? So the alleles for medium size will tend to decrease over time, and you'll end up with two separate peaks, right? So the individuals that are very small will do well, and the individuals that are very large will do well. This disruptive selection can increase variation in a trait, right? So any alleles that allow you to be smaller and smaller or larger and larger will also be favored. So you can see that variation has spread out more, right, over time. So the variation is increased. All right, so we have an example of disruptive selection in black-bellied seed crackers. So this is a bird.
Yeah, birds!
Yeah, birds. So this is our original population here in the light color. And there was some kind of a mortality event. And
why are the birds always dying in this class?
Well, they're not all dying. See, look, it says survivors. Those survived.
Okay.
So the juveniles that were very small and the juveniles that were very large did the best. the ones that were kind of in the middle size did the worst, right? Because the seeds that were available were either large or small. There were no medium-sized seeds in this particular environment, so the birds with medium-sized beaks ended up dying. Consequently, the alleles that were associated with medium beaks were selected against, and the alleles for the large beaks over here and the small beaks were favored. And so this kind of disruptive selection maintains variation in the population, meaning variation in the alleles that code for beak size. So one cool thing about disruptive selection is that at its extreme, it can cause speciation, which is the formation of new species. So if you have an individual with an extreme trait that prefers to mate with similar individuals, you could end up with two completely distinct populations that may eventually form new species. So for example, in the example that we just kind of gave with this here, let's say it coded for the trait we're looking at is the color in the fish. If, for example, the blue fish like to mate with the blue fish and the green fish like to mate with the green fish and nobody likes to mate with the teal fish, over time you would find fewer and fewer teal fish and more green fish and more blue fish until you have a complete separation between these two peaks. And when that happens and there's no more gene flow between the two different populations, they may become new species. But we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. All right, so the final kind of natural selection is called balancing selection, and this is when no one allele has an advantage. You could have balancing selection when heterozygous individuals have higher fitness than homozygous fit individuals do. So we found some cases of this in which if you're a heterozygote, you'll do better and survive better, have more offspring than homozygous individuals. That is called heterozygote advantage. Because heterozygotes survive, you always have A1s and A2s in a population, right? Neither of the two alleles will become fixed or lost. A second reason why you can have balancing selection is that sometimes you have certain alleles that are favored at different times and places. So maybe one allele is favored in one part of the season and another allele in another part of the season. So consequently, neither allele is fixed and neither allele is lost. And then third, sometimes you have alleles that are favored when they are rare, but not when they are common. So this is called frequency-dependent selection. So for example, it may be best to be different from everybody else. If you're different from everybody else, you may have higher fitness than everybody else. But then you have higher fitness, so you have more babies, and now you're not rare anymore, right? And so then that allele becomes less common, etc., etc. Just a cyclical pattern. So all of these kinds of balancing selection maintain genetic variation in the population. They prevent alleles from getting fixed or lost. All right, so maybe you guys can describe to me in words how genetic variation for build depth in this population would look after directional selection. All right, so you over there in the corner, what would this graph look like after directional selection? Well, like, the curve would be like the same shape and size, but it would move to the right. Yeah, it would move to the right. Could it also have moved to the left? Yeah, it could also have moved to the left, but just like left or right. Yeah, so that's directional selection. All right, Kat.
Why are you always calling on me?
Because you're here. All right, stabilizing selection.
Alright, stabilizing selection is when the average is the same, but it's like the graph is pinched in so that it's taller and skinnier.
Yeah, that's a good description of it. All right, dog. So what does disruptive selection look like?
Well, you know I'm a disruptor.
Yeah, I do know you are a disruptor. But what is this graph supposed to look like?
It looks like my dog bowl.
It looks like your dog bowl. Okay, maybe you should describe in more detail what you mean by that.
It's got a little well in the middle and it's like two peaks on either side.
Yeah. All right, so why do you have those two peaks?
Because it's when being average isn't good, so it's better if you're extreme.
Okay, fair enough. All right, bird. Are you recovered enough from all of the sad stories to tell us what balancing selection is?
Yeah, sure. I guess if it's balancing selection, then the graph would look exactly the same afterwards.
Yeah, so in balancing selection, the graph would look exactly the same. It will not have changed at all, okay? How can you tell the difference between balancing selection and stabilizing selection anyway?
Oh, if it was stabilizing selection, like, the peak would be really high and skinny.
Yeah, and in balancing selection,
it just looks the same as before.
Yeah. All right. Which forms of selection increase genetic variation?
Oh, disruptive selection!
Yeah, disruptive selection increases genetic variation. Which forms of selection decrease genetic variation? Directional selection. Yeah, directional selection. What else?
Stabilizing selection.
Yeah. What's going on with balancing selection?
Well, it should be just like the same, so it shouldn't increase or decrease, I guess. It should be like the same.
Okay. All right, so here's a table, right, to kind of help you with that. I think we've talked about all of these different things other than I encourage you to think about examples. I think we did all these. Oh, I didn't give you this example. Did you know that guppies, female guppies, prefer male guppies that look different from the other guppies? So if you are a male guppy that has a rare color phenotype, female guppies will mate with you, and then you'll have lots and lots of babies. And then in the next generation, your color pattern that used to be rare is now really common, and then the females won't pay any attention to it, and instead they'll pick a different male color pattern besides that. As a result, because of each of these color patterns becoming rare and then common, then rare, then common, many different color patterns are maintained over time. Okay. Okay, so sexual selection is a form of natural selection. Okay, and this is a form of natural selection when females choose certain males and or compete against themselves to secure mates. So there's intersexual selection and intrasexual selection. So let's make sure we have our vocabulary straight. What is, let's see, a word with intra in it, like intramural sports. So in intramural sports, who competes? Oh, it's like you're competing within your school. Yeah, you're competing within your school. So intrasexual means within one sex. And then inter is like interstate, right? So where does an interstate highway go?
Oh, it goes between states.
Yeah, it goes between states. Okay? What? Okay. I don't know why these are flashing. Anywho, so intersexual selection is between the sexes, so it's females choosing between males. Intrasexual selection the competition occurs within one sex. So this is where males are fighting one another for access to females, usually. Sometimes the reverse. Sometimes females fight for males. All right. In most species, females invest more in their offspring than do males, okay? So in some species, females actually need to take care of the offspring and feed them or provide them with milk or carry them as a pregnancy or just eat more food that gets put into eggs, right? Or spend more time laying eggs. So usually because eggs are larger and require more of an investment, females have to invest more in their offspring than males, okay? As a result of this, female fitness, right, is limited by their ability to get the resources that they need to make more eggs and healthier offspring. So usually, because of this fundamental asymmetry, females end up producing relatively few offspring during their lifetime. Conversely, with males, males can produce as many offspring as they can find females to convince to mate with them, right? So male fitness is limited only by the number of females that they can mate with. And because sperm are relatively inexpensive, males usually have the opportunity to mate many times, right? Okay, so Bateman and Trivers developed a hypothesis of sexual selection that predicted that females should be choosy about mates since they invest a lot in each egg, right? But the males will be less choosy because they are not investing very much in the sperm that they're contributing. So because females have a lot bigger investment in this reproductive event than the male does. The female should be choosy, and the male should compete for access to this egg. And so, if this happens, the alleles that increase how attractive a male is, or that increase the ability of the male to fight with other males and win to get access to females, these alleles should increase in the population. And one of the major components of the Bateman-Trivers hypothesis predicts that sexual selection should generally act more strongly on males than females. So males are under more pressure to compete with one another than females. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of female choice here. So oftentimes females will use particular indicators about the way a male looks or acts or sings or dances as a signal that that male has good alleles, right? She has relatively few eggs and she doesn't want to waste them on a male that is not going to give her good offspring. So she looks to whatever she can see about the male to figure out whether he's likely to be able to provide either good resources, like physical things, like feed the babies, find a good place for them to live, or whether he will contribute good genes so that the offspring will be healthy. So in some species of birds, their colorful beaks or their colorful plumage is due to carotenoid pigments. So do you guys remember carotenoids from 1113? Remember what section we talked about those?
Oh yeah, that was in the photosynthesis section.
Yeah, and photosynthesis, right? So carotenoids tend to be like reds and yellows, right? So that's what color those pigments are. Carotenoids in animals can help protect the tissues and the immune system, okay? But animals can't make their own carotenoids. They have to be able to eat plants in order to get carotenoids. So this is one reason why a lot of animals will eat brightly colored fruits, is to be able to get those carotenoids. And this is just an example of two birds of the same species, one who has had access and the ability to eat lots of carotenoids and the other one who didn't. So from the female standpoint, the healthiest bird should be the one who's the most colorful, right? For two reasons. One, a bird that has dull colors maybe had to use up all of their carotenoids out on immunity and has no carotenoids left to put into their feathers, or the males with dull colors just were really bad at finding food and they just couldn't get any carotenoids. So if the female chooses the brightest colored bird, then he's a bird who has such a healthy kind of immune system that he didn't really need to use very many carotenoids on his immune system, and he's really good at getting carotenoids, so he has plenty to put in his immunity and his feathers. All right, so the female, if she chooses a colorful male, she's more likely to have offspring that are better at fighting their own diseases and also offspring that are better at feeding, right? If these are heritable traits, the ability to fight diseases and feed, then the female that chooses a colorful male will have a successful offspring. And so experiments have been done on zebra finches that support the hypothesis that females prefer these colorful males. And so they kind of manipulated just the color and left everything else the same. So they took pairs of brothers of these zebra finches and they gave one of the brothers extra carotenoids and the other ones not. And the females, all except for this one female here, preferred the male that had eaten the carotenoids. So females do have a preference for these colorful beaks. We have lots of other examples, though. It doesn't have to just be things that we think of as like smart, like birds, right? We have a lot of female fish that prefer males that protect the nest site and care for eggs until they hatch. So we have one of these mouth brooding fish here where the male broods the babies in his mouth. So the female picks very carefully for a male that's going to help raise the offspring. And here's a seahorse where the father provides a pouch for the offspring. In lots of mammals and birds, males will provide food, protection, and resources for rearing offspring, so females will try and choose males who can do that. So females may choose males based on either their physical characteristics that indicate male quality on a genetic level, or behavioral characteristics that indicate their ability to provide parental care, or both of these. All right, so that was female choice. Now we're going to talk about male-male competition. So one of the classic examples of male-male competition comes from elephant seals. So you can see these guys here are fighting. Sexual selection is really intense in elephant seals, and it's driven by male-male competition. So where the elephant seals live, there are relatively few beaches that the females want to kind of, crawl up on and give birth. And so when a male finds a really good beach that females want to be on, he will defend it. And so the fights can get really bloody. This is blood from the males kind of jabbing each other with their tusks. So the male elephant seal will establish a territory after they fight and then defend that territory so that he's the only male that can use it. So basically every female that comes ashore, he will mate with that female, or I guess, that's kind of like how this system works. And so if another male comes around, he will fight the other male and make the other male go away so that other male will not mate with females. Okay, so a male that can win fights with other males will monopolize matings with females in that territory. And we know that for sure. The bigger the male, the more likely he is to win a fight. One thing that you can easily see with elephant seals is that the males are more than 4 times larger than the females. Like, the males are enormous. So on a particular island, scientists measured the lifetime reproductive success of each elephant seal. And they found that a few dominant males sired most offspring, while most males lose fights or father few or none. So there's lots of variation in male reproductive success. All right, so I was going to ask you to help me plot a histogram for male and female mating success in elephant seals. And to remind you of what a histogram looks like, this is a histogram of exam scores from another semester, right? So you can see here, the y-axis is the number of students who got each score, and then the score is along the bottom, okay? So for the elephant seals, this is the graph for males, and this is the graph for females. This is the number of male elephant seals that mated each number of times, and this is the number of time that each male mated, number of females that mated each number of times, and then the number of times that each female mates, okay? And just a reminder here, I've already told you that that the bigger guys are more likely to be able to mate than the smaller ones, okay? All right, so do you guys want to each take a turn coming up and drawing your graph, what you think is going to happen next?
Yeah, I'll come up and do it first. I'm just doing it first, okay?
All right, so all right, what do you think the relationship is between the number of times each male's mate and the number of males that mate each number of times?
Like that, and then for the females, like that.
Okay, so can you describe in words what that means?
Yeah, it means like everyone kind of mates about, like, I don't know, like, okay. So you have like a few males that mate 0 times, some that mate 2 times, the same number mate about 4 times, the same number mate around 8 times, same number mate around 10 times.
Okay, so you think that's about the same with females too?
Yeah, like, yeah, most females, they just like, yeah.
Okay. All right. Dog, you want to try this?
Okay, I'm coming.
Ugh, what is that?
Don't ask.
All right, so tell me what you got going on here.
Alright, I think it's like, okay, well, I don't want any males to not mate, so that's 0. And like then you have the most males that mate 10 times, and then like just a few mate only 2 times, like that. So then with the females, most of them mate a lot, and then some of them don't mate very much.
Okay. You up there in the corner, you want to take a try? I can't see that. That's really small. I'm really small. Okay, I'm really sorry. I don't know what you just drew. All right, Bird, you want to try it?
Yeah, come over and peck it out.
All right, come over and peck it out. All right, so what do you think?
I think like that, the most males will mate a lot and some won't mate very much at all, and then the females, they'll be like about the same number of females mating each number of times.
Okay. Should we see what actually happened?
Yeah, okay.
All right, so I already told you that male elephant seals are more than 4 times larger than females, right? Okay, I already told you that part. All right, this is what we get. What they found is that a few dominant males had most of the babies, and most males didn't mate at all.
That doesn't look like what any of us said.
No, I guess not. So there was just like 1 or 2 males that fathered 81 to 100 offspring. Most males mated 0 times, so over 90% of the male seals died without reproducing.
That's sad.
Yeah, that's sad. In females, there's less variation in reproductive success than males, so you guys kind of got this right, right? About 60% of the females died without leaving offspring, but the rest of them, there's less variation. Like, there are no females that had 81 to 100 offspring, right? The most successful females produced up to 10 offspring, okay? So you can see this is a flatter line. So males have, I'll go back to males, much more variation in reproductive success, ranging from 0 to 100 offspring, than females do. They only range from 0 to 10. So we know that large males win fights, and so the alleles from large males are going to increase in frequency in the population, right? And so there becomes directional selection for large body size. So the larger males have more babies, so the alleles for being large are passed on to the next generation, and so in the next generation, the large males have more babies, etc., etc. Okay, so directional selection for large body size. One thing that you might notice is that there are often differences in sexually selected traits between males and females, and that is because females are more likely to get a mate than males. So sexual selection tends to be more intense than males and in females. So if you saw with the previous graph, many more of the females were able to mate than the males, right? So sexual selection tends to be more intense than males and females. There's more competition amongst males to mate than there is for females to mate. Males tend to have more traits that function in courtship or competition. So if you look at ways in which males and females tend to be different amongst species, usually the males tend to have these weird elaborate traits that are involved in either courtship or competition with other males. Sexual dimorphism refers to any trait. Maybe we should break this down. What's di mean? Two. Yeah, morph.
That means form.
Yeah. So sexual dimorphism refers to any trait that differs between males and females of the same species. All right, take-home messages from selection. Selection can favor certain phenotypes in a population and cause the alleles for those phenotypes to increase or decrease in the frequency. Selection results in evolutionary change, and sexual selection also violates the assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg principle, as does natural selection. Okay? I should point out, by saying sexual selection violates the assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg principle, not just sexual selection. Both sexual selection and natural selection do this. Different agents of natural selection can act on an organism at the same time. And so when that happens, you can get some traits that are favored or fitness trade-offs between traits. So for example, we know that sexual selection will favor long tails in peacocks. Okay? So females prefer males with long tails. So males with long tails get to have more babies. But ecological selection, meaning selection caused by predators, favors shorter tails. So males with shorter tails are more likely to escape from predators. Okay, so there's a trade-off. If your tail is too long, you may have lots of babies, but you may die very quickly. If your tail is too short, you may live a long time but not have very many babies. And then finally, I want to remind you that natural selection is the only evolutionary process that results in adaptations, okay? So we're going to talk about a variety of different evolutionary mechanisms, but only natural selection causes adaptation. All right, the second mechanism, so far we've talked about non-random mating, right? Non-random mating causes changes in genotype frequencies, but not allele frequencies. Now we're going to talk about the 4 mechanisms that cause changes in allele frequencies. So natural selection causes changes in allele frequencies. Genetic drift causes changes in allele frequencies. All right, so genetic drift is any change in allele frequencies in a population that is due to chance. And so we can look at genetic drift using computer simulations. So imagine a case in which, kind of like what we're going to do in lab, you have like a cup full of beans, right? In this case, your cup is full of 4 beans, so not very many beans in your cup, okay? This graph here, we'll say that the beans are allele A1 and the allele A2, okay? So we're only graphing one of the 2 alleles because we can presume that if A1 is 50%, then A2 is 50%. If A1 is 80%, then A2 is 20%, right? So we don't need to draw both of them. They would just mirror each other. All right, so we can simulate over and over again, drawing, alleles out of these cups, or to just have the computer do it for us. And so in some populations, you can see here each of these gray lines represents a different population. So all of the populations eventually either go to fixation or loss, meaning they end up being all 4 individuals are A1, A1, or all 4 individuals are A2, A2, okay? So in this population, allele A1 drifted to fixation in less than 20 generations, and in this population, the allele A1 was lost, okay? All right, so one thing that we can see is that if we increase the population size, it makes it much less likely that alleles become fixed or lost, okay? So the larger the population size, the easier it is to maintain genetic variation in your population. All right, genetic drift is random with respect to fitness, okay? So whether an allele is fixed or lost, it doesn't mean that allele that got fixed is better than the one that got lost, right? These are non-adaptive changes to allele frequencies. Genetic drift can be a real problem if you're trying to conserve a species because, like we just showed you, genetic drift can have its largest effects in small population sizes. So if you have habitat destruction and other human activities that reduce the size of the population you're trying to preserve, you could potentially, you're likely to have genetic drift, right? And so we know like nature reserves or zoos have very small population sizes. And over time, genetic drift can lead to random loss or fixation of alleles, okay? And this, every time you lose or fix an allele, you lose genetic variation in your population. And as we talked about before, having low genetic variation makes you more likely to not be able to respond to natural selection. All right, so I'm going to describe 2 ways in which you can end up with genetic drift. The first one is called the founder effect, and the second is called a bottleneck. A founder event, like a founder, when you say like our founding fathers, who is that?
That's just the people who showed up.
Yeah, the people who showed up first, I guess, from a particular population. So a founder event occurs when a group of individuals establish a new population in a new area. So here's the old population, and so some of these individuals go to a new place, right? And allele frequencies differ from the source population to where they end up, okay? So these 3 individuals went over to a new population. The original population has this kind of red, purple, and blue, but by chance, it just happened none of the blue ones ended up going to the new population, okay? As a result, the new population is missing that blue allele. And so this isn't something that happened because blue is good or blue is bad, just by chance alone. It just happens that those 3 individuals got on the boat and went to the other place, okay? So that is a chance event that causes differences in allele frequencies in the new population than in the old population. So that change of allele frequencies is called a founder effect. You can get founder effects very frequently when you have isolated habitats like islands that become colonized by other islands or the mainland. So every time you have a founding event, you're likely to have a founder effect. So you just end up continuously changing allele frequencies through genetic drift. So I'll just show you an example here. I went on vacation once when I was living in France to the Ile de Groix, which is a little island in Brittany. And on this island, weirdly enough, the horses had mustaches. Why, right? The mustache is not naturally selected. It doesn't help the horse to have a mustache. It doesn't hurt the horse to have a mustache. It's just the thing that it's got. And the reason for this is because one of the settlers' original horses, when he came from the mainland of Brittany to the island, happened to have the alleles for mustache. And because relatively few horses were brought over, that allele was disproportionately represented on the island, and so now all of the horses have mustaches. All right, and again I point out, they don't have mustaches because mustaches help them, right? They have them because they happened to be the alleles that arrived on the island. The second way in which you can have genetic drift is through a genetic bottleneck. And this is a sudden decrease in population size in a large population. And so people imagine that it's kind of like if you have a large bottle and you're shaking beads out of it, they get caught in the neck, right? So that represents going from a large population size to a small population size. And this could happen if you have a disease outbreak and nearly everybody dies, or a natural catastrophe. All right, so let's just imagine that you start out with a lot of people, and then like a giant rock falls down on your population, and these individuals survive. They don't survive because they're better suited to their environment. They didn't do anything to escape from the source of mortality. They just got lucky, right? However, if you notice, this red allele is missing from the individuals that survived. So when these individuals reproduce and reproduce and reproduce to repopulate their area, the red allele will be missing, okay? So population bottleneck causes a reduction in the number of alleles in a population suddenly. An example with humans happened in Pingalap Atoll, and so originally there were thousands of people on this island in the atoll. And in 1775, there were only 20 people that survived. It was one natural disaster after another, and only 20 people survived. One of those individuals, we think, had a loss of function allele at the color vision gene called CNGB3. And so individuals that happen to have two mutated CNGB3 genes have a particular kind of color blindness called achromatopsia. And so a lot of people are colorblind, but this is a particularly unusual form of color blindness. In the original population of thousands of people, achromatopsia was relatively rare, but because just one of those 20 people happened to have the allele for achromatopsia, the frequency of achromatopsia in this population is greater than 20%. And this is likely due to the extreme population bottleneck. So maybe most people on the island have some relative that could trace back to the 20 survivors. All right, the third mechanism that can cause changes in allele frequencies, meaning evolution, is gene flow. So gene flow is easy. It's just the movement of alleles between populations. It could be like an individual just gets up on its feet and walks from one place to another and joins another population. It could be like if you are a flower, that the flower stays where it is, but its pollen blows somewhere else, right? Okay. If you have gene flow between two populations, it tends to make allele frequencies between the two places more similar, right? Because you're exchanging alleles back and forth. So what are the effects of gene flow between populations? This is a series of studies that's been done on captive bred and wild populations of steelhead trout. So some of them were wild, and some of them were raised in a hatchery and then released. And so they used DNA tests to study the fitness or number of surviving adult offsprings of individuals that either had two wild parents, two captive parents, or a wild parent and a captive parent. And so on average, compared to the fitness of fish with two wild parents, fish with one captive bred parent had 16% lower fitness, and fish with two captive bred parents had 38% lower fitness. So the take-home message here is breeding fish in a fishery and then letting them go reduces the fitness of the wild fish, right? So gene flow from captive to wild populations actually in this case reduces fitness. Okay, so gene flow can affect the conservation of species that are threatened or endangered. So we know that often you have habitat that used to be continuous and then people build on it and break it up into little pieces. And when the little pieces of habitat become isolated, you get no gene flow between the different populations living in those islands. And we just saw, okay, so in the first case, in the first example, gene flow is good, right? So having the habitat be continuous increases your fitness, and having the habitat fragmented decreases your fitness, right? So gene flow can benefit fitness. However, in the example I just gave you, gene flow can reduce fitness, like in the example with the trout. All right, gene flow take-home messages. Gene flow is random with respect to fitness, so gene flow can either increase or decrease fitness depending on the situation. Gene flow can replenish alleles in a population that has lost alleles, right? So for example, if you have a conserved species, you may find, like, for example, with those, with the mountain lions, right, the cougars, from Florida, you can replenish the genetic diversity by bringing in individuals from another place, right? So I brought in those Texas cougars to mate with the Florida ones. Gene flow from captive bred to wild populations can reduce the fitness of the wild populations, right? So we saw that. All right, so we're on to the last form of evolutionary mechanism. Name and describe as many kinds of mutations as you can think of.
Oh, like an inversion.
Oh, an inversion. Do you remember what that is?
That's when a piece of a chromosome gets flipped around. Here, let me show you.
Oh, wait, slow down, dog. Okay, don't show us anymore. Okay. What other kinds of mutations? Point mutation. Yeah, what's a point mutation? It's like just one nucleotide gets changed. Yeah. What else?
Like a deletion. Like you can have a deletion of like just one allele. You can have a deletion of a whole chunk of a chromosome.
Yeah, those are all possible. Anything else?
Yeah, you can have an insertion where like you have a piece of chromosome gets stuck somewhere, or like a nucleotide gets stuck in somewhere.
Yeah. All right, these are all possible. Okay, so now you remember what a mutation is. So I already told you that natural selection and genetic drift tend to reduce genetic diversity over time, right? Natural selection, excuse me, reduces the diversity of alleles that do not allow individuals to increase their fitness, right? Genetic drift reduces genetic diversity by chance. Mutation restores genetic diversity by making new alleles. So mutation is random with respect to the fitness of the individual. So mutation doesn't occur in a way that tends to either increase or decrease fitness. Whether an individual's fitness increases or decreases is just by luck alone. All right, so people have done studies, right? And they've exposed like bacteria and yeast to mutagens, right? These are substances like chemicals or X-rays that cause mutations, and determine what the effect was of each of what is the effect of being exposed to a mutagen. So most mutations result in deleterious alleles. Do you guys know what deleterious means?
It means bad.
Yeah, deleterious is bad. So most mutations result in deleterious alleles, right? So alleles that have lower fitness tend to be eliminated, right? So if you have a mutation that causes your fitness to be less good, then you're not going to have as many babies, and that allele will be eliminated from the population. Many mutations produce neutral alleles, meaning the allele doesn't have any effect on fitness. Can you think of a mutation that we know will have a neutral effect?
Oh yeah, a silent mutation.
Yeah, silent mutation. What's that?
It's like when you swap you swap a nucleotide and it makes the same amino acid.
Yeah, remember that we have lots of different amino acids that we have amino acids that have lots of different codons that code for them, so you can swap a nucleotide and then not have an effect on the amino acids, right? All right. Sometimes, very rarely, you get a lucky mutation that provides a beneficial allele. So when that happens, the fitness of the individual with the allele increases. And so you would expect that those alleles should increase in frequency in a population due to natural selection. So mutation can change the frequencies of alleles over time, but usually you don't have mutation alone having enough of an effect to change allele frequencies. So for example, the only way in which mutation all by itself could have an effect on evolution would be if you had, I don't know, some weak spot in your DNA that tended to code make little a's into big A's over and over and over again, right? That could cause you to have more big A's over time. That's very unusual. Instead, mutation tends to have an effect on evolution when it's combined with something else. So you have a lucky mutation that allows you to have the right variation that allows natural selection to act on it, or you have a lucky mutation or an unlucky mutation in combination with genetic drifts. You happen to have a mutation for a disease that gets spread because of genetic drift, or for example, I don't know, you have some mutation that gets moved from one population to another by gene flow. All right, so people have a lot of fun having little experiments in which they take bacteria like E. coli and they kind of breed them to see, well, breed them, they allow them to reproduce in the laboratory and then allow them to compete with other lineages of bacteria to see which lineage wins. So they put them in a dish together and see which one can take up more of the dish, right? Which one can grow faster. The cool thing about bacteria, though, is you can take bacteria and if you have a lineage that you like, you can put it back in the freezer and save it and then rehydrate it and bring it back to life later. Okay, so this is a lineage of bacteria that's being competed against an ancestral lineage of bacteria that kind of lives in the freezer and then comes out periodically to fight this lineage. So you can see over time, so first, when they're fighting against each other, right, the fitness of the competitor doesn't change, and then suddenly there's a big leap, and the fitness of the competitor goes way up. And then no change for a while. They, have many generations of fighting each other with no change, and then suddenly the competitor goes, fitness goes up again, and then again. Okay? So what do you guys think? What could be causing fitness to suddenly increase in these bacteria?
Well, this part of the chapter is on mutation, so I'm gonna guess mutation.
Yep. So what's happening with mutation?
I guess they get like a lucky mutation that allows them to outcompete the other lineage, and that makes them jump up in fitness.
Yeah, that's basically it. So what you have is a beneficial, so you have mutation happening all the time, right? And the mutations are neutral or even deleterious, and then suddenly you get a beneficial mutation in your lineage and your fitness jumps, right? So this is a combination of mutation and natural selection acting together to cause a difference in the population. Just one more example here. So in aphids, the color is determined by carotenoid pigments, and you have a polymorphism. What's that mean? That means multiple forms. Yeah, multiple forms. And that is maintained by balancing selection. Which one was balancing selection?
Oh, that was the one where, like, the curve stays the same.
Yeah. Okay, so we know that ladybird beetles, otherwise known as ladybugs, prey on red aphids, and that parasitoid wasps lay eggs on the green aphids. So we have different things killing each color. So when you get too many, if you get a lot of red ones, those will get killed off by ladybugs, and then the green ones will do really well, and then those will start getting killed off by parasitoids, and then on and on and on and on. Okay? So we tend to have both of the two color alleles maintained. Do you guys remember, how did the redbirds get their carotenoids?
They eat them.
Yeah, they eat them. Aphids are actually the first animals ever discovered that can generate their own carotenoids. And so there was a gene, the ancestor of the aphids was, we think, gray, and there was a gene that coded for a metabolic pathway that came in from a lateral gene transfer from a fungal symbiont. So these green aphids were living with a fungus, and then the fungus was able to transfer some of its genetic material into the nucleus of the aphid cells, and then that basically got incorporated into their genome. And so you end up with an initial event that causes the red aphid from a lateral gene transfer, and then one of those genes gets deleted, and then that causes the green aphids. So it is interesting. So we know the mechanism that shows how mutation can work with natural selection to have these different colors. Also, it should be noted that we have when you had the lateral gene transfer, you also have a duplication and diversification event that led to the red color, and then a deletion event leads to the green aphid. So we can see how mutation occurring with natural selection caused the color, and also it's a good point of showing that a deletion of this particular gene can sometimes be adaptive. All right, mutation take-home messages. Mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation. Okay, so even though things like crossing over, what's crossing over?
Oh yeah, that's when you have like the tetrad chromosomes in like prophase 1 of meiosis, and like the little legs get twisted around each other and they break off.
Yeah.
So gross.
I mean, I don't think it's gross. I think that's the way it works.
Okay, whatever.
All right, so that's crossing over. Do you guys remember what independent assortment is?
Yeah, independent assortment is like in metaphase 1, when all the chromosomes line up, like the direction that they line up will dictate like which chromosomes end up in which of the which of the gametes.
Yeah. Okay. So crossing over and independent assortment, which we talked a lot about in meiosis in 1113, they will shuffle the existing alleles into new combos, right? They don't make new combinations. Only mutation creates new alleles. A second thing is that we have to make sure we keep remembering that mutations just happen by chance. You know how mutations happen. We learned all about it in 1113, right? None of those mutations happen because an organism wants it or needs it to survive. The mutation just happens, and perhaps if there's a lucky mutation, you can take advantage of it. If there were no mutations, evolution would eventually stop, because you would stop by this sentence maybe doesn't make sense. Without mutations, evolution would eventually stop. So you need to have genetic variation in the population in order to have the kind of fuel for natural selection to act on. But also, if every single individual were fixed for a particular allele, then there's no more evolution, right? Nothing else can happen. Mutation alone usually doesn't have an effect on allele frequencies, right? Because, like, a single individual will get a mutation when they undergo meiosis to, pass on a gamete for the next generation, and that mutation will be completely unique, right? So that doesn't really affect allele frequencies. It affected just one allele in the giant gene pool, right? So it doesn't usually have a large effect on changing gene frequencies. All right, and just a little table to summarize, and we're going to kind of go over this table here when we meet on Wednesday. So hopefully you learned all about these processes. So these are the 5 assumptions of Hardy and Weinberg principle. These 4 are considered evolutionary processes because they affect allele frequencies. This one here affects genotype frequencies, although it doesn't affect allele frequencies.